Well, hey there! Today I'm going to show you how to make custom stencils with the help of your Cricut machine. I'm going to be testing two different methods today. I'm going to be doing stencil vinyl, and I'm also going to be using acetate as a reusable stencil. I'm going to be stenciling on a cork board, but you could do this on wood or any other type of material that a stencil or paint would work with. I am going to be testing, like I said, a stencil vinyl approach here, and I'm going to be using just a Oracle stencil vinyl for that, and then I'm also using clear acetate as a reusable stencil option as well. So either material can work for this project. I will give you sort of my feedback on which one I think works better. Additional supplies that you're going to need are going to be, of course, the stencil vinyl if you go that route, your Cricut machine, you'll need paint, you'll also need paint brushes. I recommend like little sponge brushes, they work best for the dabbing effect. You may also want to have like a paint pen in a matching color for any little edges that you might want to sharpen up or clean up. A Cricut scraper if you're going with the stencil vinyl route, and a weeding tool if you're going with the stencil vinyl route. And then you're going to also want to have clear acetate or mylar, which is perfect for cutting out if you want to go for the reusable stencil option. If you are cutting out the stencil vinyl, you can use a standard green mat. If you're cutting out the mylar or the acetate, then you'll want to use the purple strong grip. For the stencil vinyl approach, you'll also need to have transfer tape as well. If you're going for the reusable stencil approach, you're also going to want to have some painter's tape. So I've already loaded my Dahlia templates up here in Cricut Design Space. If you would like these templates, they are free for you below. If you're using the acetate or the mylar to create the reusable stencil, you will select that material in Cricut Design Space under Custom Settings. Go ahead and choose stencil vinyl if you're going for the one-time option of the stencil vinyl approach. I'm going to be testing both today, but I'm going to start with the acetate here. I've gone ahead and I've purchased a very thin, clear acetate. This works really well also for like cake stencils in addition to paint stencils. And I'm placing this onto my strong grip purple mat. And you want to use a strong grip just because the material, it's plastic, it's a little bit thicker than like say paper or something like that, or vinyl, and it's a good idea just to have it on a strong grip option. I've selected the acetate setting in Cricut Design Space, and my machine is now going to cut this out. You can do this with Explore, Explore 2, Maker, Maker 3, Explore 3, all of those machines will work with an acetate material. I am peeling the mat away from the material, and we want to save the cutout part of our stencil here. So that is how it turned out. It turned out really well. I didn't have any issues with the acetate at all. It cut through just fine. So my first approach here using this reusable stencil, I am using painter's tape, and I am going to place the stencil where I would like to start working. For me, I'm going with the top corner here. You can see there are 3 flower cutouts on this reusable stencil, and I'm going to be focusing on the top corner one there to the top right. And I'm just adding painter's tape around the edges and a little bit in the middle there where it'll kind of stick through the stencil to make sure that everything is nice and flat and is not going to move on me as I am painting using this stencil. I'm using a very basic white acrylic paint here. You can pick these up at craft stores online for $1 or $2. They're very inexpensive even for the large bottles. I'm using a round foam brush here. I like the round ones and the foam ones because they work much better for like a dabbing effect. So you want to really dab up and down. You don't want to brush like you would traditionally. You want to go up and down in a vertical fashion when you're working with a stencil. So just make sure you don't do anything like back and forth rubbing, or you will get a lot of bleed lines with your stencil. So just take your time with it, up and down until you've covered the entire area that you initially worked with. I am working on a cork board here, so I did end up going over it a couple of times just to make sure that it stood out. I also found that if you first seal the cork board with a clear acrylic sealer, it will also prevent the paint from soaking into the cork board. So that's a little tip if you struggle with that at all. If you're working on like, wood or something else, you probably won't really need to worry about that too much. You could consider sealing it though after the paint dries, just to preserve it and make the paint stencil last longer. Alright, so once I finished that, I went ahead and lifted the stencil off, and you can see it turned out really well. This was my very first time trying this, so I sort of found some, I got a little bit more into it after the first one and kind of figured out how to handle the stencil in a way that allows me to perfect my stencil transfer. There was a little bit of bleed on one of mine. I think it was because I got too much paint. You want to make sure you're not soaking your brush. You want to do very, very light amounts of paint. Dip your brush in the paint and then kind of like dab it off a little bit on the side first before you place it onto the stencil. That way it's not going to seep underneath that stencil and cause like bleed lines and things like that. So the reusable stencil worked really well all in all. I didn't have any major issues with it. It might take a tad bit more patience just because you're lifting and moving things around. Unlike with the stencil vinyl, you can be a little bit more one and done with it. Since this is a reusable though, in between my painting here, I just went and rinsed off the stencil and dried it and then placed it back down to ensure that all my paint from my first transfer was rinsed off before moving on to the next one. So for my corkboard here, I'm adding these cute dahlia designs. Like I said, you can get these templates for free below. And I'm going to be putting these in a school station area in my home where my kids' homework and notes and notebooks and calendars and all that stuff is going to be going. So I thought it would be fun to dress these up a little bit. Now let's try the stencil vinyl. You can buy stencil vinyl at craft stores. You can also check Amazon. There's an Oracle brand stencil vinyl. It'll look blue like this. And I'm going to cut the same design out, but I'm going to use stencil vinyl this time. I'm again using my Cricut machine. You can cut stencil vinyl with any of the Cricut machines. It will work with that. And I'm selecting the stencil vinyl setting in Cricut Design Space. So there is a specific stencil vinyl material setting, and you'll want to search for that in Design Space to make sure that your machine is cutting out at the right pressure. So my design is finished cutting, and now I'm going to weed it. So unlike with the reusable stencil, you do have to weed it because you're dealing with stencil vinyl. So I'm getting rid of the excess vinyl here, and I'm going to be weeding out. Typically, you would remove the background and leave the design itself. This is known as reverse weeding when you're working on a stencil. So I'm actually removing all of the design parts that you would typically keep if you've worked with vinyl at all before. I'm removing the areas that you would typically keep because we want to create a stencil effect. So we're basically doing what's called reverse weeding, and we're removing all the little pieces and we're leaving the background piece behind so that we can transfer that to transfer tape, and then we'll be able to put it onto our surface. Now, one of the reasons I like working with the stencil vinyl a little bit better is because it's sticky. So you don't have to go the painter's tape route, and you can have everything stick right down to your surface so that it's not going to be moving around on you. I've cut a piece of transfer tape here, and I'm placing my design upside down on the transfer tape. I found that just works a little bit better rather than trying to place the transfer tape on top of it. I was able to get it on top of the transfer tape a lot smoother by laying the design face down on it. I'm trimming off my excess transfer tape here, and then you want to burnish the design really well. Burnish is a fancy term for rubbing your design onto the transfer tape or the surface that you're trying to transfer it to. I'm using my Cricut scraper here, and I'm starting on one side here, and I am burnishing it back and forth. You're also going to want to flip it over and do the other side as well. Once you've finished burnishing your design, you're going to want to flip it over and you'll want to peel the liner off so that your stencil vinyl is now on the transfer tape. Like I said, I am using a corkboard here. You could use wood or anything else that you would traditionally stencil on. I'm going to place this stencil vinyl at the top corner of my corkboard here, and I'm going to burnish it again with my Cricut scraper. Now, transferring this onto corkboard was a little tricky because of the corkboard surface, and I wanted to kind of see if it was even possible to do on the corkboard. Wood would be a lot easier, but it did work as long as I took my time to burnish, and then I was slow about peeling that transfer tape away while bending and sort of creasing and rolling the transfer tape away to get that stencil vinyl to stick to my corkboard. If you're working on a wood surface, it will work that much better and that much easier. And now I'm going to repeat the process of adding paint just like I would to the reusable stencil. Make sure you sort of dab the paint on. The stencil vinyl works really well with controlling your bleed. You still want to be careful that you don't soak your brush too much in paint and that you kind of dab it on the side of the palette before you actually put it onto the surface itself. But because the whole thing is a sticky stencil, basically, being stencil vinyl, it works really well with keeping those lines nice and sharp. If I had to declare a winner between the stencil vinyl versus the reusable stencil with cutting acetate out or cutting out mylar on your Cricut machine, I would probably go with the stencil vinyl. However, the reusable stencils do have their purpose too, in the fact that they're not one and done. You get to reuse them more than once, so there is that benefit there. Alright, so I'm removing my stencil vinyl now. I would advise to let your paint set for maybe like 5 to 7 minutes, just to let it set up a little bit, because you're sort of pulling at your surface quite a bit more than if you were just lifting an acetate or mylar stencil straight off. So letting the paint set up just a little bit is really helpful to make sure that your lines stay crisp. And looking at this design, I definitely think the stencil vinyl did a better job overall. If I place both of these side by side just to sort of compare, we have the stencil vinyl one here on our left, and then I have the one that we did with the reusable stencil on my right here. And you can see they both turned out really well, but I do think that the stencil vinyl one turned out a lot crisper than the one, a lot cleaner lines, a lot crisper than the one with the reusable stencil. If I had to declare a winner, I would say the stencil vinyl was definitely the winner. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I can't wait to see you guys next time. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss any future videos.